hello. Can I just say it's really nice to have someone actually pronounce my name correctly for once in my life. My family's never been quite certain if it's Northern Irish or Scottish, but everyone drops the second R, so that has been very pleasing. Thank you for that. Alrighty, so hello. So what am I talking to you about today? Well, cryptography. It's this sort of bogeyman. A lot of people don't really know what it is, or they ask me what it is. They have some ideas, but they're not quite sure. The reason I wanted to talk about cryptography, apart from the fact that I love it, is it's been used by the elite in history, and we'll see this as we go. It's been only accessible by political leaders, by the wealthy, by the military, and recently it's suddenly become this thing that everybody uses. I mean, this Zoom connection that we're speaking on right now is secured using cryptography. It's automatic, it's built into all of this software that we're using. I think it's really important that people have a bit of an idea of how it works. It's also one of the oldest fields of computer science. It's been around since prehistory. There's some people even claim that the hieroglyphs used in ancient Egyptian tombs were a form of cryptography, or at the very least they used cryptic symbols rather than the symbols that they would normally use. So it goes way back to 1000, even 2000 BCE, depending on who you ask. I think that's really interesting for such a relatively young field of study. So there's a few aspects to cryptography. There's obviously encrypting things with ciphers and codes, but it's also about identity and authentication. How do you know who people are? How are you sure that you're talking to the right person? How do you know you're talking to your bank when you log in? There's also a question of what you're saying. So not just secrecy, but also making sure the messages are correct and haven't been tampered with. The questions of how we achieve this, protocols, you may have heard of HTTPS. I'm sure a lot of you are at least vaguely familiar with HTTPS, and that's probably the most widespread use of cryptography in the field today. And why? Well, I tend to feel quite strongly that when you're involved in technology, security and privacy is, or at least it should be, at the center of what we're all doing. We all see lots of examples of controversies in Facebook, Google, spying on data, data mining, questions about security breaches. So in Australia, we had a large amount of health data that was breached and dumped onto the public internet. So these kinds of things, I really encourage you, if you're working in or interested in tech, to get a little bit of an idea of what's going on. So who am I? Well, when I was a teenager, I really liked video games and I wanted to make my own. And that turned out to be quite difficult. But I did learn to code, and that turned out to be really, really useful. I went and did a physics degree at Melbourne Uni in Australia. That's my home country where I was born and raised. I did physics because I really liked physics, but the career prospects were not especially bright, so I decided to defer to computer science. And that's where I discovered my current main love, cryptography. I found a nice supervisor who was working in the field, and things just sort of went from there. I'm now studying my PhD at ETH Zürich in Switzerland. So that's near the German border, for those of you who might be wondering. I'm studying theoretical cryptography. So what I do now is it's a lot less code, a lot less software. It's now mostly just maths, really, but I like to think of it as all related. And if you're like me and had never heard of ETH before you decided to apply for a PhD there, as their marketing team insists, they are the uni that Einstein studied at and I believe did not do terribly well in. So don't ask me about long haul flights. I landed in Switzerland 2 weeks ago. It was a 23.5-hour flight. And yeah, I'm still a little bit sleepy at the best of times. Righto, so what are we doing today? Well, first of all, I want to show as many people as I can why I love cryptography and why hopefully some of you will learn to love it, or at least have your curiosity sparked. And second, I want to talk about how hard it is to get cryptography right. There's this old adage in software, you may have heard it, don't roll your own crypto. It's a bit of a slogan, but what we mean by this is it's really easy to get cryptography wrong, but have it look right. And we're going to see literally thousands of years of people getting cryptography wrong as we continue through this talk. And I also want to convince you that you should care, at the very least, if not specifically about crypto, you should care about security and privacy if you're involved in tech. And this is something that I hold very near and dear. It should be one of the things that we really focus on in all of our work. Righto, so let's get started. I'm going to take you down a bit of a wild journey. The title is The Meandering History because we took, as a species, as many societies around the world, we took a long time to really figure out how to do cryptography right. And we're going to see a lot of examples of doing it horribly, horribly wrong before we finally get to having some idea of what we're doing. So we'll start in prehistory. So one of the earliest, clearest samples I could find is this cipher called Atbash, and it's found in the Hebrew Old Testament, the book of Jeremiah. And it's probably not the earliest example of what you might call cryptography. There are examples, as I said, ancient Egypt, also Babylon, a few other ancient societies used ciphers or things similar to them. But this is one that I can really hopefully explain in some detail. So there's this slightly curious passage, and I don't speak Hebrew, so I'm taking this translation on faith from Oxford. And all the kings of the north, near and far, one after the other, and all the kingdoms of the world which are on the face of the earth, and the king of Sheshach shall drink after them. And if you're a biblical scholar, which again I am not, you might be wondering, who is this mysterious king of Sheshach? There is no such place as far as anyone's aware. It turns out that for some reason, when Hebrew scholars were originally writing this, these documents, this book, they used this interesting little cipher. Now, this is part of the Hebrew alphabet. And what they did was they took the first letter and mapped it to the last letter, second letter and mapped it to the second last letter. And I know this is backwards, this is left to right. I had a lot of trouble with getting Unicode to behave. So it's this interesting cipher. Imagine replacing A with Z, B with Y, C with X, and so on. And that's essentially what happened here. And what you'll find if you go through this in the original Hebrew, they're talking about the king of Babylon. So, maybe they didn't want to name drop Babylon explicitly, so they used this interesting cipher to encode the name. And I believe there are a few other examples, but ask a theologian if you want to know more about this. So we're in the 600 BCE, at least, roughly. That's when Jeremiah lived, so that's my rough estimate for when this likely occurred. So now we come to probably the most famous cipher. I learned about this when I was a kid. Some of you have probably heard of it. It's called Caesar's cipher. And surprisingly enough, this actually was used by Julius Caesar, or at least according to Suetonius writing about Julius Caesar, it was used by Julius Caesar. So there are also letters of his to Cicero, his being Julius, as well as to his intimates on private affairs. And in the latter, if he had anything confidential to say, he wrote it in cipher. That is, by so changing the order of the letters of the alphabet that not a word could be made out. So how did this work? Well, Suetonius explains in a slightly obtuse manner here. He must substitute the fourth letter of the alphabet, namely D for A, and so on with the others. This is about 100 BCE that Julius lived. So here's how it worked. There's a lovely bust of Julius here from Wikimedia for us to be inspired by. He would take a letter, go 3 spaces along, and replace it. So if I wanted to encrypt, air quotes, because we'll see it's not a very strong cipher. If I wanted to encrypt the word hello, I would replace H with K, E with H, L with O, L with O again, and O with, oh, that's an R. That's a nice typo. But I was just testing you, of course. So this is a very simple, what we call a substitution cipher. And you could use it with any, it doesn't have to be 3 spaces. You could imagine 2 spaces, 5 spaces, 10 spaces. If you get to the end of the alphabet, you just go back to the beginning and start from there. So this is unrecognizable, at least at first glance. But there's a few issues with this cipher. So sorry, Julius, 2,000 years ago, you were barking up the wrong tree a little bit. Here's one of my favorite adages encrypted in Julius Caesar's cipher. You might wonder what's going on with these spaces and punctuation marks. Don't we want to hide those too? We'll get to that, but again, we're in 100 BC, so we can go a bit easy. All right, so here's the issue. Well, first of all, if you know the rule, if you know that you're replacing each letter with several letters along, there's only 25 possible keys. right? A key being how many letters along you shift. Not 26, because if you shift by 0 letters, then you haven't really encrypted anything. So 25 keys. And it doesn't take that long to go through a message and count out the number of possibilities until you say, aha, they were shifting by 11 spaces. And the other glaring issue, at least when it comes to English, is we have single letter words. We have words like I and A. And if you see a single letter word, you know it's one of those two. So you can easily work out without much effort what the secret key was. What if you don't know the rule? Well, any cryptographer, anyone doing a subject in cryptography at uni will learn. We have this trick called frequency analysis. We'll come back to it. But the point is, if you know the rule, you can easily break this cipher. Even if you don't know the rule, there are ways. So now we enter the Dark Ages. We have about 1400 years will pass before anyone has any really good ideas. So it took a really long time, as I say, for cryptography to really develop into a mature field. So next up is the Arabs. They had some really good ideas, it turned out, not just about algebra, but also about cryptography. There's a book attested to in the historical record, the Book of Cryptographic Messages by someone named Al-Khalil. And he introduced the field of cryptology in this book. Cryptology is about the systematic study of ciphers. So it's about coming up with new ciphers, studying their properties and how they work. Unfortunately, the book has been largely lost. We don't really know what it actually said. We only know what people said it said. And around the same time, about 800 CE, Al-Kindi wrote a book, The Manuscript for the Deciphering of Cryptographic Messages. And that introduced what we now call cryptanalysis, which is about studying ciphers in order to break them. And not just guessing, like saying, oh, well, maybe it's this cipher, no, that didn't work, let's have a different idea. Cryptanalysis is all about coming up with ways to mathematically break down and study ciphers. So Al-Kindi introduced a few techniques for this, including the aforementioned frequency analysis. So this is one of the oldest ways to break a cipher. And it works like this. If you look at this chart on the right, English letters are not uniformly distributed. E is by far the most common letter in your average English text, followed by T and A and so on. So if you take even a short text like this adage that I encrypted earlier, you start to see the most common letter is in fact E. The second most common letter is not T, but it is in the top few. The third most common letter is R, which breaks the rule, but as you go on for a longer text, you can start to get a more educated guess. And this is for avoidance of doubt, E is the most common letter after you undo the cipher. So if the most common letter is H, you would probably expect that it was originally an E, because that's the most common letter in English. So Al-Kindi came up with this idea in about 800 CE, and this completely destroys T's cipher. It has not a hope of working. In fact, it completely destroys what we call a monalphabetic cipher. So any cipher where you always replace a letter with the same symbol is hopelessly broken, because you can always do this frequency analysis. It took about 900 years before, as far as we can tell, anyone had this idea. So Caesar's doing okay. He's certainly doing better than any of today's cryptographers, but we'll see how that works out. So the next big idea was in 1300s, 1400s. Again, this was an Arabic scholar who came up with these ideas. Call them substitution and transposition. And they're the main ways that we build ciphers. In fact, we still do this today. So this was rediscovered in the West about 100, 200 years later. But this man, Ibn al-Durayhim, I apologize for that, came up with these ideas, didn't call them the same thing, but it was the same idea. So substitution is what we saw before with Caesar's ciphers. You take letters, replace them with some other letter. And then transposition is about mixing up the order of letters. So here I've got the Pig Latin rule. Hopefully many of you learnt Pig Latin in your primary school years and tortured your relatives with it. The idea is you take the first consonant, chuck it at the end, and put an A on the end. And these are the two main ways that you can jumble up or hide information in a message. And this was in the 1300s, so not too bad. Alrighty, now we're starting to hit some actually good ciphers. So it took humanity about 2,000 years, but we're getting somewhere. So two people, an Italian man named Alberti, and depending on who you ask, either a Frenchman called Vigenère or another Italian man whose name I cannot recall at this instant. Depending on who you ask, one of these two people invented this cipher. There's a little bit of kerfuffle about that. I couldn't find an authoritative source, so not my problem. So Alberti had this idea. If you look on the right, there's these two disks, and by choosing a particular arrangement of the disks, so moving them in as you please, and then using the symbols, so in this case, you might replace an A with a lowercase g, a B with a lowercase k, and so on. And as you go, you rotate the wheel by a fixed number of steps. So maybe after you encrypt your capital A, you shift the wheel by 2 places for encrypting a B. That would make it an N instead of a K. And this is what we call a polyalphabetic cipher. So this is something that turns out to be very, very difficult to break unless you know the rule. If you know the rule, it's quite easy, and I'll show you an example of that in just a second. But if you don't know the rule, this is very difficult. You can't do frequency analysis because suddenly an E might be a lowercase p here, but over here it might be a lowercase r, might be a y over there, might even be a 1 over here. So you can no longer do this trick to break the cipher. And if you have a computer, then you can just sort of blast your way through it. These are early ciphers. We didn't have the computational power that we do now. The Vigenère cipher, I've included it. It's a little bit later in the 1500s, but I've included it because it's relatively simple. It's not too hard to understand. And this one actually it stood unbroken for 300 years, which is a pretty solid effort if you ask me. So I've written out in some pseudocode for those of you familiar with like C or Python or whatever. The idea is you take each letter of your message. So here you might take H, and each letter of your key, which is like a password that you encrypt with. In this case, my key is my key. You add them together, and then you take the remainder modulo 26. In other words, imagine taking the alphabet, counting along. If you get to the end, start again, and just count until you get to the place of M. Okay, so you're adding M to H, and then wrapping around the alphabet. And you get this output TCVPM, and this is a polyalphabetic cipher as well. You can't do frequency analysis to this. And as I said, this was not broken for 300 years. So it turns out this is actually quite a good idea. It's easy to break if you know how it works, because once you can figure out some things about the keys, you can do some maths to it. I'm not going to talk to you with the maths, but you can do some clever things to break this cipher. And it turns out that we use a lot of these similar ideas in our modern ciphers that are protecting us today. So interestingly, around this time, ciphers started to enter the political discourse. Obviously, Julius Caesar was a politician, but now about 1600 years later, we're starting to see the Roman Catholic Church and sects and rebellions within the church were using ciphers to communicate. There was the case that led to Mary Queen of Scots' execution, in fact, involved ciphers, which was a fun fact that I learned. King Louis XIV in France made heavy use of ciphers. So we start to see, I don't want to quite say military yet, but certainly cryptography is entering the eyes of the state and rebellions who are trying to hide their activities from the state. So we're starting to see some political implications emerge. So the next landmark I'd like to point out is this man. Some of you might have heard of him. Fermat's last theorem was a famous result that was proved in the 90s. Pierre de Fermat, he was a French mathematician who had this sort of interesting observation. If you take take any number A to the power of a prime number and take the remainder modulo that prime number, so divide by the prime number, take the remainder, you get the same number back. And all of his peers were like, huh, that's funny. I don't know why I should care, but cool. And we'll get to why you should care, why, in fact, a lot of people care very much about this, but no one really cared about 300 years. So if your work isn't being picked up today, maybe in 300 years' time it will. Don't know if that's any solace, but our old friend Euler, if you've done a bit of maths, you'll be very familiar with this lovely Swiss man. he proved Fermat's theorem. Fermat just said, this is true. And everyone said, oh, okay. But Euler actually managed to prove to everyone that it was in fact true. And he actually came up with a powerful generalization that turned out to be, again, extremely useful, but not for about 200 years after his death. All right, and here's a fun little stop along the way. So progress in the field has kind of stagnated the last 300 years. We had Alberti and Vigenère come up with some good ideas, but everyone's sort of, this works. Edgar Allan Poe, of all people, was a cryptanalyst in his time. He would publish advertisements in the Philadelphia newspaper saying, give me your ciphers and I will break them. And in fact, he did. He broke almost all of the ones that he was sent. And he even wrote a poem / short story. I don't exactly know how to classify it, but you can read that if you're interested. This was around the time where, if you've heard of Charles Babbage, who is sometimes credited with inventing the first model of a computer, if you've heard of Charles Babbage, he also studied cryptography and he started to come up with some systematic ways to study ciphers. And this was eventually what led to the Vigenère cipher being broken. These kinds of systematic mathematical approaches, rather than just sort of guessing and doing our best to say, can we find any issues? This was the beginning of formalism in cryptography. Not a lot really happened. There's a few political, some assassinations, some treason plots. It's all fascinating. You can read about this. There's a few books on the subject that I'm happy to recommend if anyone's curious. In 1919, these two, a US Navy official and an engineer working at AT&T invented the only unbreakable cipher. We in fact proved this later. There are no other ciphers that are unbreakable. This is the only one, or either this one or things quite similar to it. So the idea is you take a very long random sequence of symbols and you take your message. I've encoded it in ASCII here. If you don't know what ASCII is, it's just a way to take letters and turn them into ones and zeros. So you take the bitwise XOR, meaning if they're the same, you've got a 0. If they're different, you've got a 1. Unfortunately, this isn't quite lined up in the render, but that's okay. If you combine your message with this long random sequence of 1s and 0s, you end up with, in this example, I've got -099:. And this cipher is provably unbreakable, that you cannot break it. And the reason for this is, if this was some other key, if you don't know the key, you have no hope whatsoever, because any key could produce any message. So you can in fact prove that there is no hope whatsoever of breaking it unless you find out what the key is. In particular, you can never use this long sequence of bits ever again. You can only use it once, hence the name one-time pad. I find that interesting. This turned up in 1919. It is entirely unbreakable, but not very practical, because you have to have this long key and you can never use it again. Alrighty, so this is probably the most well-known example of cryptography in history. The Enigma machine that was used by the German military, not just during World War II, also in the lead up to World War II, but was used by the Nazi regime famously and was broken in the Allies' effort, and that gave them a massive leg up. Some even claim that it changed the outcome of the war. So a lot of people may have heard of Alan Turing, a famous computer scientist who did a lot of extremely important things in the early days of the field. A lot of people know him as the man who broke Enigma. It's actually not entirely, there's a little more to the story. I don't have time to go through it in great detail, but Polish code breakers, here's Marian Rejewski, who was involved, and a few other people as well, reverse engineered the code in the 1930s. So you see here, I've got 1932. So it actually started before the Second War. He's reverse engineered the cipher, and it works roughly in a similar way to Vigenère, but a lot more complicated. And if you compare it to today's ciphers, it had about half the security or a quarter the security. So it's not a weak cipher, but it turned out to have a flaw. And the Polish, together with Alan Turing and his friends at Bletchley Park, managed to scale up the operation. They managed to build machines to break the code. And as I said, some say it changed the outcome of the war. So now we're entering the stage of modern cryptography. This is what I study. This is the emerging field. And this is where we finally start to see some maturity, some people who actually know what they're doing, thinking about this, coming up with some proper formal definitions of what's going on. So in 1949, a man named Claude Shannon, if you've done any computer science study, you might have heard this name, quite an influential figure in the early days of computer science. He was probably the very first to really sit down and come up with some mathematical formalisms. Why do we care about mathematical formalisms? Why is this relevant? Well, we can't prove things unless we can state them carefully. And when billions of dollars and people's lives are depending on it, we want to be able to prove things. So he came up with these interesting ideas, and we still use these ideas today. This idea of unconditional security. So if your adversary, the person you're defending against, has infinite computing power, can they break the cipher? If they only have a finite amount, can they break the cipher? So say they have 100 years of the most powerful supercomputer, then they can break the cipher. We say this is an acceptable compromise. And then perfect secrecy, which, as we said, only the one-time pad could do that. And Shannon actually proved that this was the only way to do it. So we're finally entering some careful analysis. Okay, now the first widespread cipher that we still see sometimes today was called the data encryption standard. And as everyone knows, the most important thing that happened between 1949 and 1975 was that computers entered the mainstream. By far the most important. Can't imagine any other events that might have any relevance to anything. So now we can take messages, break them into bytes, we can mix up keys, we can do all these operations very, very quickly and do lots of them. We use this substitution and transposition that our Arab friends came up with 600 years ago, put all that together, and we end up with a cipher that's roughly similar to Vigenère and Enigma, but much more difficult to break. In fact, the only reason this cipher is considered broken is because it had a small key size. And depending on who you ask, the NSA may have had something to do with it. I think that particular theory is not relevant here, but there's always conspiracists afoot. And it's quite closely related to the modern cipher that we do actually use. Most of the time now we use the advanced encryption standard, which was replacing the data encryption standard when it was shown to be a bit broken. So this wasn't a bad idea. This was a very good idea. It was just not pulled off especially well. Alrighty. Now we enter the stuff that really makes your head spin when you first look at it. So on the right, we have Diffie and Hellman, two American computer scientists who won the Turing Award in 2015 for their work, only 40 years later. That's fine. So if you want to communicate in secret with your friend, if you're Alice, you want to talk to Bob, you need to have the same key. And this is what we had ages ago. I mean, my key in the Vigenère cipher, you've got to make sure the person who's decrypting it knows the key. And then, well, maybe you send it by mail, but someone could take the letter and you'll never know that it was tampered with. Diffie and Hellman worked out how Alice and Bob can just yell stuff out in public, tell everyone some information, and they can still work together using some clever maths to get a shared secret key. And we still use this today. This is one of the most important breakthroughs, only slightly overshadowed by what I'm about to talk about next. So key agreement, something that we still use to this day, almost the same protocol. The king of cryptosystems, 747 of cryptosystems, for those of you who also like planes. On the right, we have Shamir, we have Rivest, and we have Edelman. This is, in my opinion, the most significant cryptographic breakthrough that has ever happened, the most important thing that we've discovered. And our old friends Fermat and Euler, if you take the things that they notice about numbers, you can do something that seems at first glance impossible. You can have a public key, a key that everybody knows, something like your address, anyone can send you a letter. You use this to encrypt things. And then you have a private key. So imagine you've got a mailbox, it's locked and only you can open the mailbox. Anyone can put stuff in, but only you can unlock it. This is what Rivest, Shamir, and Edelman did. And this really kicked off a revolution that led to all of the things that we take for granted today: HTTPS, secure browsing, secure email, all of that. RSA is still used today. A lot of the websites you visit will use it. It's a bit dated. We have better schemes now, but people are still using it. Maybe they shouldn't, but oh well. Their work was absolutely groundbreaking and was the basis for a lot of really important subsequent work. So we now enter the modern day. It's 40 years, I mean, a lot has happened, but not a lot has happened that has really changed the world just yet, depending on who you ask. So we have signatures now. The idea is I can sign a message digitally, and now everybody knows that I sent this message. Everyone who knows my public key is certain that I sent this message. This is something, again, this sounds impossible, but we can do it with the help of our friends RSA. There's a protocol called TLS, which is what you use in your browsers whenever you connect to a website these days. We use all of these ideas. We take a signature, prove that the server is who they claim to be. We use Diffie Hellman to generate a secure key that we can use, and that secure key, together with AES, lets us communicate in secret. So that's how all of these ideas have come together. And of course, no talk in crypto would be complete without talking about Bitcoin. Everyone take a drink. Bitcoin and blockchains in general use these ideas. I'm not going to hammer on about it because it's a bit of a hot topic and everyone's sick to death of hearing about it, I'm sure, but we use these ideas to prove that history is correct, some definition of correct. And there's a lot of active research going on right now to see what other types of things we can prove. And of course, all these topics are extremely complicated, not my topic for today. So the last thing I wanted to go over was, we wouldn't be complete without talking about some controversial politics. So for a long time after the Second World War, militaries went, cryptography is really useful for waging war. We better keep the good ideas secret. And in fact, for those of you, for the English among us tonight, 2 MI5 GCHQ agents actually came up with the Diffie Hellman protocol 2 years before Diffie and Hellman did, but because they worked for GCHQ, they couldn't tell anyone, so bully to them. A lot of these things were, and in some cases still are, classified as weapons, munitions. In the US, there was an infamous fight, Google the crypto wars for more, claiming that RSA, you can't say that RSA is a weapon. And the reason they say is, look on the right, I've got this jumble of characters. That is in fact Perl code that implements RSA. That's it, that's all it takes. And it's a simple idea, and everyone's saying you can't just say this is a weapon because everyone can do it, and it's important for keeping us safe. That is the argument. I tend to agree with it, but you can always come to your own conclusions. My home country, Australia, still has some of these laws, so you can get sent to jail for quite a long time if you make certain mistakes. There's a question of security agencies deliberately weakening stuff that does get out. So if you're interested in a very complicated story about this, Google this keyword, dual ECDRBG, and the Snowden files all but confirmed that the NSA did in fact deliberately plant this as a weakness in a protocol. It's been long since fixed, we think, but quite an interesting story there. And the last thing, quite a hot topic today, is end-to-end encryption. So this is this idea where if you're using Signal or WhatsApp, or there's a bunch of other services, company servers cannot decrypt messages. You send a message to someone, the only person who can read it is the person you sent it to. So even if there's a wiretap between you and the server or at the server or whatever, law enforcement, whoever you like, cannot read the message, even in theory. And there's been a lot of debate around the world about whether this should be allowed, whether it should be regulated. The issue that I see here is that if you introduce weaknesses to allow law enforcement officials to break end-to-end encryption, then anyone can break it. This is a well-known phenomenon in cryptography. If there's a hole, people will find it. So there's a very complicated discussion to be had about what the right thing to do here is. And I'm just going to deftly sidestep it and leave it at that with a lovely photo of my new home, the informatics building at ETH Zürich. So I hope you learned a thing or two. I hope some of you had your curiosity ignited tonight. And I'm more than happy to answer any questions, any curiosities. There are no stupid questions, absolutely not. This is a complicated topic. So anything at all that occurs to you, ask away, and I'll be around for the next half of the chat.